So there's 3 pheromones you should know about in relation to white-tailed deer.
Understanding that you really have 2 separate populations of bucks that you see during the summertime versus those that are going to pack their bags and be out of there, often before gun seasons even get in. So if you're a bow hunter, you really got to roll the dice sometime.
Wow, isn't that exciting? Just seeing a mature buck in the wild is really cool, but seeing a buck make a rub, that is really special. But have you ever wondered why bucks make rubs and what actually happens when they're making rubs? When you look at whitetail rubs, there's different types. There's brush rubs, there's a single rub that you find in the woods, there's rub lines, and then you find clusters of rubs in the woods, and normally what that's going to indicate is it's pretty near a buck's bedding area. I'm not going to get into that today. What we're going to talk about today is the science behind rubs, because there actually is a science behind whitetail rubs. So when we're talking about whitetail rubs, there are actually chemical signals that a buck leaves behind every time he rubs a tree. It's amazing when you think about it, and how scientists figured this out is equally amazing. So what we know through research is that whitetails leave pheromones behind after they make a rub, also when they make scrapes. These pheromones include chemical signals that indicate to other deer the presence of these bucks in the area. But let's first talk about pheromones. Pheromones are relatively new to the scientific world. They were discovered in 1959 in Germany among researchers who were looking at insects. They found that insects of the same species leave pheromones behind during the mating process. Over the years, over the decades, other researchers learned this translates to mammals. Humans also emit pheromones, but not in the same way that animals do. But we're talking about white-tailed deer. So there's 3 pheromones you should know about in relation to white-tailed deer. There's informer pheromones, releaser pheromones, and priming or primer pheromones. Informer pheromones, these basically they serve really no purpose. There's releaser pheromones that will evoke an immediate behavioral response. So when you think of a releaser pheromone, think of when a buck is lip curling and there's a doe right there. He's lip curling, he's processing those chemical signals, and he goes after that doe because he knows she's ready to breed. But when it comes to buck rubs, priming pheromones or primer pheromones are the key pheromone that we need to know about, because these result in a physiological response in white-tailed deer. So what we know about primer pheromones in whitetails is they can be detected in 2 different ways. Number 1 is the main olfactory epithelium. That's the nasal passage. It's a large passage inside the deer's nasal cavity, and that's how they can smell so well. The second thing is through a small little organ called the vomeral nasal organ, and that's in the roof of the mouth. These 2 different ways of detecting pheromones act a little bit differently. When it comes to the epithelium, again, think about that when a buck is lip curling. He's trying to draw in that scent, especially from a urine, maybe a urine you put out in a scent tripper or an estrus doe that's nearby. He's inhaling that air. He wets his epithelium by licking his nose, because that entire nose, just like a dog, it has to be moist for him to really detect that scent and to process those chemicals into his brain. The epithelium is bringing in that liquid form of scent, or in this case, pheromones. In the vomeral nasal organ, that is through a chemical signal. So that could be when this buck is making a rub, that chemical signal that's left behind, those pheromones that left behind, another buck, a doe, anything coming past that, investigating that rub, that's how they process those pheromones. So why do whitetails leave chemical signals behind when they make rubs? What sense does that make? Well, it serves 3 purposes, and these are really fascinating. Number 1, it helps synchronize reproductive cycles. Some people think that it helps kickstart the rut in a way. Second, it brings adult does into estrus early. And this really makes sense when you look at data from research projects as to which does breed first. Normally in well-balanced herds, it's those older does. They are the ones who take that cue, and that's when the rut starts. And number 3, pheromones deposited at rubs and scrapes suppresses the aggressive behavior of younger bucks. Is this foolproof? No, it's not. But in well-balanced herds, those mature bucks kind of keep everything in order, and this helps when they're marking their territory with rubs and scrapes. It's sending signals out to the other deer in the herd that this is his area. Again, not 100%, but this is his area, and now everything's going to start. In the final analysis, chemicals left behind at rubs and scrapes, pheromones, help condition the vitality and health of the overall deer herd.
Understanding that you really have two separate populations of bucks that you see during the summertime around your property, those that are going to stick around your neighborhood and you have a chance to kill them, at multiple times perhaps throughout the season, versus those that are going to pack their bags and be out of there, often before gun seasons even get in. So if you're a bow hunter, you really got to roll the dice sometimes. And
Deer and Deer Hunting Properties is brought to you by Spy Point Trail Cameras.
About 2/3 of whitetail herds in our country breed in the last couple of days of October through about Thanksgiving. So that month covers about 65 to 70% of all whitetail herds, and that's kind of where we're on the beginning of that. And frankly, it's a favorite time of year for me. I prefer the latter stages of the pre-rut into the first couple of days of the peak rut, but just because bucks are just trolling and they're out there and dropping their guard. So it's a magical time. In fact, I'm going this afternoon. I'm anxious to get back out again myself.
Yeah, same here, and that's what we're going to be doing. One thing that I found interesting over the years, and you will notice when Brian talks, he's always referencing research because you worked with it for so long. But with that habitat partitioning that you call it, like you said, you might be out there in July and August getting pictures of these nice bucks, and you think, oh, well, they went to some other, miles down the road. Well, for a lot of guys, they're hunting small properties. Like you said, that might be literally right next door. And that's something that I think, isn't it important for people to keep in mind?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I tell hunters all the time, if you've got a history of bucks on your property and you know that some of them stick around all season based on summertime trail camera photos, as well as those during the rut during the hunting season, those are what I call locals. And if they do it one year, there's a high probability they'll be back in the same area next year. However, if you've got a buck that I call leavers, those that typically pack their bags and split sometime in mid to late September, early October is a common time. Those are bucks you got to get on fast and hunt quickly, because there's a good chance they're going to go wherever they went last year. And again, that may be a neighbor's property, it may be a mile or two down the road. So understanding that you really have two separate populations of bucks that you see during the summertime around your property, those that are going to stick around your neighborhood and you have a chance to kill them, at multiple times perhaps throughout the season, versus those that are going to pack their bags and be out of there, often before gun seasons even get in. So if you're a bow hunter, you really got to roll the dice sometimes and hunt hard and fast. And of course, as you pointed out, not only are bucks and does using different parts of the landscape's changing. You go from a typical summer food source, which may be an agricultural planting or some native vegetation in a cutover. And then once the hard mass starts falling, acorns and beech nuts and various other things start hitting the ground, and you see a shift there. And, your preseason strategy when bucks are trolling is to hunt doe groups. That's where they're going to be. As the peak of the rut hits and bucks start, pairing up with individual does, that's when, again, using behavior and using what you're seeing on the ground, then you typically would want to shift to more of a heavy cover situation where those bucks are tending does in thicker cover. Then as that peak of the rut starts to kind of transition into what we call the waning rut or the post rut, then I shift back to doe groups again. So, you're using these clues and what's going on in your deer herd to shift your hunting strategies throughout the season. And, a good thing I like to tell hunters is, as they're watching, heavy scrape activity, which typically peaks right before the peak of breeding. So generally about 7 to 10 days before the peak of conception in your doe herd, that's when the scrapes are going to start going cold on you. Bucks are going to stop hitting the scrapes as hard. So that's when, if all of a sudden you're monitoring hot scrapes and all of a sudden that goes cold on you, there's a good likelihood that they're shifting now to actual one-on-one interactions with does. So your scrape hunting should shift to more heavy cover, buck travel corridors between doe groups, that sort of thing. So yeah, exactly right. Understanding the time of the breeding season is key, but then being adaptable, if you will, to move your hunting strategies to take advantage of each of those different phases and their, associated behaviors.
And one thing I would add there is if you are a guy that's hunting a small property, which I've done my entire life, is don't give up hope, because that buck that you saw that you might have had your sights set on, well, guess what? Those deer from other properties are doing the same thing.
Deer and Deer Hunting Properties is brought to you by Orion Hunting Products, America's #1 modular deer hunting blind.
Okay, so we go from the habitat partitioning to another one that is closely related, and you actually touched on it, is sexual segregation. We know that it's more prominent or more visible in summer especially, but how does that come into play now that we're into hunting season?
Yeah, so sexual segregation and habitat partitioning, kind of a 1-2 punch as it relates to kind of whitetail behavior. Habitat partitioning is just different uses of the habitat by bucks and does. Sexual segregation is the sort of unique male bonding and female family group bonding that we see in whitetails. And the typical family unit in a whitetail herd is a matriarchal doe and her female offspring, typically sometimes 2, 3, 4 years worth of female offspring. And occasionally, the male offspring up to maximum 1.5 years of age. The young 1.5-year-old bucks typically get kicked out of the house, but obviously she'll be raising some buck fawns. But that's kind of the family group. Bucks have their social structure during the summer and winter, during their bachelor group time of the year. Once they break up, they're pretty much flying solo at that point, and kind of work one-on-one. And that's very unique to whitetails and what we call sort of solitary breeders. They're very different strategies than, say, elk. Elk are more harem, gregarious breeders. So whitetails work one-on-one. They find a receptive doe. They court her for some period of time as she's entering peak estrus. He may stay with her, a day and a half during her peak conception period, breed her multiple times. He may get displaced by another buck during that period or just leave her, and another buck can breed her. And we have good evidence now that about 1 in 4 sets of twin fawns are sired by 2 different bucks. So a lot of hunters don't realize when they see a set of twins, it's not necessarily a set of twins by the sake of the argument. About 1 in 4 of those have different dads. And in fact, in one case at Auburn University in a captive facility, they've documented triple paternity, where a set of triplets came out of 3 different sires, bucks. So yeah, lots of interesting things going on there behaviorally, but that's what makes them the fascinating creatures that they are.
Yeah, and isn't there we actually published it, and I can't remember the article, but with those multiple paternities, there is, I don't want to say a preponderance, but there is some evidence that yearling bucks are sires of some of those multiple offspring.
Yeah, there's actually been some good research done by a friend of mine who's a PhD researcher at Texas A&M Kingsville currently, but he did this while at Mississippi State. And he looked at 3 different herds, a public managed, sort of what you might call a traditionally managed herd with fairly young buck age structure, looked at a quality deer management area in Oklahoma, and then used the King Ranch in South Texas as the trophy management area. So we looked at he looked at 3 different populations, very different buck age structures, sex ratios that kind of were the gamut of traditional, quality, and trophy management. And in fact, found almost exactly the same thing in all 3 locations, which was very fascinating, that about 1/3 of all the fawns at each of those locations were sired by 1.5-year-old bucks.
Wow.
And that's not surprising in a traditionally deer managed herd where the oldest buck may be 2 or 3 years of age, and most bucks are 1.5. However, on the King Ranch, where 50% of the bucks were 4.5 plus,
Wow.
so, I mean, about a very old buck age structure, even in those situations, the yearlings were getting about 1/3, covering about 1/3 of the does, and therefore siring about 1/3 of the fawns. And again, that goes back to this sort of sexual segregation topic, because again, if whitetails were elk, one mature bull elk can breed a lot of cows if he can protect his harem. Whitetails don't work that way. They work one-on-one, and it ties up a lot of time and energy for one buck to, pair with one doe, sometimes, several hours before she enters estrus, and then a day or two after. So you're talking about, up to 2.5 days of time with one doe to breed her. During that time, other does are cycling. And, so other bucks have an opportunity to breed. That makes it very different. And that's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that because so many bucks breed, so many whitetail bucks can contribute, that means it's very difficult to quote unquote mess up your genetics because so many bucks are contributing a little amount. The bad news is because of that, it's almost impossible. And there's been plenty of research to document this, to quote unquote improve your genetics by shooting, subpar bucks. Doesn't mean there's not a reason to do it. If you're in an island or a high fence situation, then yeah, you can probably impact genetics at some level. However, in free ranging wild deer herds, don't fool yourself that shooting 1 or 2 poor antlered bucks is going to make any genetic change to your deer herd. Doesn't mean they don't need to be killed for other reasons. We've got some subpar antlered deer on our property that we will kill in a heartbeat, mainly because they're taking up space, they're bullying other bucks, they're increasing stress levels within our buck population. So there are some legitimate reasons to kill mature bucks with poor antlers, but genetics is really not, the leading reason to do so.
Deer and Deer Hunting Properties is brought to you by PH Outdoors.
Today, let's talk about scouting trail cameras, especially cell cameras. If you put all the time and effort into a property, be it yourself, be it your lease, you planted the food plots, hung the tree stand, you owe it yourself to scout this thing properly. If you're not familiar with SpyPoint, they're one of the first to really adapt to that cell technology. And this is the Flex Plus, which is really cool. The Plus, I don't know if it stands for this, but it has double the battery capacity. If you're not using cell cameras, you should be, first off, because the amount of intel you can get. A lot of them have the option, or this one does have the option where you can run it where it'll send you a batch of photos, or you can use it as a constant capture, which doesn't sound really important until you're out there in the woods. So just envision yourself out there hunting in November. I'm across on the other side of my farm. I get a picture immediately from a constant capture of a deer moving in a particular area. If I'm on my own farm, I probably know where that deer is going to end up. I could quickly crawl around, do a back end, and get in position to possibly harvest that deer if it's a target animal. I think that gives you an absolute huge advantage. Cell cameras overall are cool in that you don't have to wait for your photos. So literally, even if you do the batch, you get to see them instantly, and it's kind of fun to monitor the deer. This one does it all. It's a cell, it'll capture, it'll run video, it'll run regular trail camera images, or you can use it as time-lapse. Time-lapse, again, if you're using it more of a scouting, is great for those big destination food plots of 5-6 acres, because now a deer doesn't have to be 10 feet in front of that camera to trigger it. It's going to trigger it, automatically at a set time, and you can have the field full of deer and you can monitor that activity. If you're not using a trail camera, especially SpyPoint and the cell technology they have, you're missing the opportunity that's going to give you the advantage of killing a big whitetail come fall. The SpyPoint, the cell technology, is going to allow you to do it no matter if you're using it for video, still shot, or time lapse. This is going to give you that observation with you not being there that you're going to need to hunt it successfully.